The moment Commander J-Rix called my name, the entire mess hall on the resolute horizon erupted in laughter. Not polite laughter, not the kind that fades quickly, the deep rolling kind that bounces off the walls and takes its time dying. I was standing at the back of the crowded hall holding a food tray, and every head in the room turned to look at me. 7 feet of Verith warrior. At the front of the hall pointed one long scaled finger in my direction and smiled in a way that showed every one of her teeth. The human, she said loud enough to carry through the whole room. The human volunteers. Another wave of laughter swept through the audience. Verith soldiers with their broad armored shoulders shook their heads. The Arathi crew members in the corner clicked their thin fingers against their trays, which was their version of a laugh. Even Lieutenant Danny Cole, my closest friend on the ship, covered her mouth with her hand and looked at the floor. I set my tray down on the nearest table and walked to the front of the room. My name is Marcus Vale, and I am a sergeant in the Human Colonial Defense Corps. I am 5 feet and 10 inches tall. I weigh about 180 pounds. I have no bioluminescent markings, no natural armor plates, no venom, no regenerative tissue, and no sensory abilities beyond the standard 5 by the standards of almost every species on the resolute horizon. I am spectacularly unimpressive. J-Rix is 44. Duel's undefeated, built like a wall of muscle and scale, and carries the ceremonial title of Combat Prime of the Verith 4th Fleet. I picked up the registration form from the desk at the front of the hall, borrowed a pen from the officer standing there, and signed my name at the bottom. The laughter did not stop. If anything, it got louder. J-Rix looked down at me with the kind of expression you give something small that has crawled onto your shoe. She did not move to stop me from signing. Why would she? I was a formality, a joke with a signature at the bottom. Sergeant Vale, she said, and her translator Chip gave her voice a deep, steady cadence. Do you understand what you are entering? This is a Verith coalition duel. It is not a training exercise. The outcome has political weight. You represent the human contingent on this vessel. Yes, I said, and you understand that I am the reigning champion of this tournament with 44 victories on record. I read your file this morning, I said. 44 is correct. She tilted her head slightly. And you still wish to compete? I already signed, I said. So yes. She looked at me for a moment longer, then turned back to the crowd with a wide, slow smile. The human wishes to compete, she announced. The mess hall applauded. Some of it was mocking, some of it was genuinely delighted. A few soldiers from other species were already placing bets on how fast the match would end. I walked back to my tray, picked it up, and found a seat. Danny slid into the seat across from me 30 seconds later. Her face caught somewhere between admiration and pure alarm. Danny is a corporal 2 years my junior, sharp as broken glass, and one of the few people on the ship who speaks to me without a species-based agenda. She put both elbows on the table and looked at me very seriously. Marcus, she said, I need you to explain to me, in words I can actually follow, what you just did. I signed up for the duel, I said. I watched you do that part, she said. I mean the part where you chose to do it. Because J-Rix is roughly the size of a transport vehicle, and the last person she fought in a duel spent a week in the medical unit. That was Corporal Hinvith, I said. Himvith has very poor lateral movement and kept pivoting left. Jagrix exploited it 11 times in the same match. Danny stared at me. You watched the match? I've watched all 44, I said. This morning I got up early. She stared at me a while longer, then she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. You're going to get yourself broken in half, maybe, I said, but probably not in half. She didn't laugh. Danny has a good sense of humor about most things, but there are moments when she puts it down and just looks at you very directly. This was one of those moments. Marcus, why did you sign up? Genuinely, you don't have to. Nobody expects a human to volunteer for this. I ate a few bites of my food and thought about how to explain it. The real answer was not simple, and the simple answer was not completely real. After a moment, I put my fork down and looked at her. She stood up in front of everyone, I said, and listed every biological limitation of the human species: no armor, no natural weapons, inferior strength to mass ratio, short pain tolerance window, poor visual range, and low light. She went through the whole list like she was reading a grocery receipt, and everyone laughed. They weren't wrong, Danny said carefully. They weren't, I agreed. But here's the thing, Danny. She listed everything we can't do. Nobody in that room listed what we can, and I thought that was worth demonstrating. Danny was quiet for a long moment. She's going to hurt you, she said. Probably, I said again, but I've been hurt before. After dinner, I went to the supply office and formally requested a copy of the Duel regulations. The officer at the desk, a young Verith with pale green markings on his collar, looked at me with undisguised curiosity as he handed over the document. I thanked him and took it to my bunk. I read it 3 times. The first time I read for general understanding. The second time I read for specific rules about technique, restrictions, and legal contact zones. The third time I read every footnote. There were 37 footnotes. At midnight ship time, when most of the human quarters were quiet, I pulled on my training clothes and walked down 6 levels to Cargo Bay 4. It was the largest open space on the ship that was not actively in use. The lights were on half power. The metal floor was cold under my feet. I stood in the middle of the empty bay for a moment, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's engines through the soles of my shoes. Then I started to move. I did not practice strength techniques. I did not work on speed. I worked on something much smaller and much more specific. I worked on breathing under pressure. I worked on maintaining a steady center of gravity. After a hard impact, I practiced falling and recovering from the floor in under a second. Over and over and over, I hit the floor of that cargo bay with my shoulder, my back, my side, and I got up from each one without slowing down. After 90 minutes of that, I ran, not a sprint, a long, slow, steady run around the perimeter of the cargo bay, lap after lap, with the half-lit lights in, the engine hum, and the cold metal smell. Nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. Just a human in cargo clothes running in circles in the middle of the night. At some point, I heard footsteps near the entrance and paused. I looked up. Standing at the far edge of the bay was one of the Verith soldiers from the mess hall earlier. He was a big one, broad-shouldered, with the blue-gray scale pattern of the older Verith generation. He had clearly come down here by accident and found me instead of whatever he was looking for. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me run. I gave him a small nod and kept going. He stood there watching for a while longer, then he left without saying anything. I ran for another 40 minutes. When I finally stopped, I was damp with sweat and my left knee ached from the repeated floor work, and I felt clearer in my mind than I had all day. I sat down against the far wall of the cargo bay and drank from my water bottle and looked at the empty space around me. The duel was in 11 days. 11 days was not a lot of time, but it was what I had. And I have always believed that the size of the window matters less than what you do with what is inside it. I pulled out a small battered notebook from my jacket pocket. It was a paper notebook which most of the non-human crew found baffling or amusing. I had carried one since I was 12 years old. There is something about putting words on paper with a pen that keeps thoughts organized in a way that no screen ever quite matches for me. I opened it to a fresh page and wrote 2 sentences. The first was, she has a pattern when she closes distance. The second was, find out which hip. I closed the notebook, put it back in my pocket, stood up and walked back to my bunk. 11 days, not much, but enough. When I went to the ship's medical office the following morning, the physician on duty was a tall, pale-skinned Orathi named Dr. Wren. The Orathi are known for being remarkably steady and clear-eyed, the kind of species that delivers terrible news without changing their expression. Dr. Wren looked at me when I walked in with the particular stillness that Orathi use when they are deciding whether something is worth their time. Surgeon Vale, she said. Are you injured? Not yet, I said. I want to ask you some questions about Verith anatomy. She looked at me for a moment, then she sat down in her chair and folded her long fingers together on the desk. You are the human who signed the dual register, she said. That is correct, and you want to know about Verith anatomy, specifically nerve cluster locations, fatigue response patterns, visual blind zones, and body temperature regulation under sustained physical exertion. Dr. Wren looked at me for a long, careful moment. The Orathi are not easily disturbed. They deal with injury and death in complex biology every day, and they do it with great professional calm. But something in my list of questions made her go very still. That is a thorough set of questions, she said. I have a thorough problem, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then, with the particular precision of someone who is both impressed and mildly unsettled, she opened her files and began to talk. She told me about the Verith nerve clusters near the outer hip joints that, when subjected to repeated low force pressure, begin to send interference signals to the surrounding muscle group. Not a debilitating injury, nothing dramatic, just a slow accumulating noise in the body's communication system that makes the affected limb about 12% less responsive. Over the course of 40 minutes, she told me about Verith visual fields. Their forward range was excellent. Their lateral range at the edge of their peripheral vision had a soft spot between roughly 40 and 60 degrees off the central axis on the right side, a natural consequence of the way their secondary eye membrane sat over their dominant optical nerve. She told me about their temperature regulation. Verith generates significantly more internal heat under high effort conditions than most warm-blooded species. In the right environment, after about 25 minutes of peak exertion, their body temperature regulation begins to Prioritize cooling over muscular. Response speed, a small but measurable. Dip in reaction time, I wrote all of it. Down in my notebook in small, careful handwriting. When she finished, Dr. Wren looked at my notebook and then at me. Sergeant Vale, most soldiers who in these duels prepare by training their strength and speed. I know, I said. You are preparing in a different way. A different way is what I have, I said. She studied me for a moment longer. With those steady Orathi eyes, may I ask you something? Of course. Are you afraid of Commander Rix? I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said. She's very capable, and I have significant physical disadvantages in this match. Fear is the correct response. Dr. Wren seemed to consider this, and yet you signed the register. Fear and signing are two different things, I said. I closed my notebook and stood up. Thank you, doctor. This was very helpful. I left the medical office and went directly to the ship's archive terminal. In the lower observation deck, where I pulled up all 44 recorded matches of Commander Jirix, I had watched them quickly the morning before. Now I watched them again slowly with the notebook open on my knee. I watched for her movement patterns when she was comfortable. I watched for the moments when something surprised her. I watched the precise way her left hip carried her weight during a pivot, and I watched how that weight shifted differently in matches 12, 23, and 38. In those three matches, in the later rounds, her left side pivot slowed by approximately 3/10 of a second, not much, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I was looking for it. I also watched her opponents. Most of them were bigger than me. Most of them were faster. Most of them came at her with power and confidence, which she absorbed efficiently and redirected into her own advantages. She was excellent at handling force. She was trained specifically to absorb and redirect power. What I could not find in 44 recorded matches was a single opponent who had done what I intended to do. Not one. After my third full day of review, Danny came and sat beside me in the archive room. She looked at the screen, then at my notebook, then at me. How many times have you watched these? She asked. 4 complete passes, I said. I'm on my 5th, Marcus. The duel is in 8 days. You should be sleeping. I slept 4 hours, I said. I'm fine. Danny looked at me with that expression she saves for when she thinks I am being entirely unreasonable, but knows that arguing with me is a waste of time. Do you actually think you can beat her? I put my pen down and turned to look at her properly. Danny, I'm not preparing to overpower her. I'm not preparing to outrun her. I'm preparing to outlast her and outthink her within a very specific set of rules in a very specific time window. Those are different targets, and I think I can hit those targets. Danny was quiet then. She said, you know what the really unsettling part is? What? When you explain it like that, it doesn't sound crazy, and that's the part that worries me most. I smiled and turned back to the screen. On the 4th day, something interesting happened. I was in cargo bay 4 again, this time running a specific footwork drill I had designed around Jirix's right side blind spot. When I heard the bay door open, I did not stop. I kept moving, keeping my patterns smooth and controlled, and I watched the entrance from the corner of my eye. It was one of Jirix's junior officers, young Verith named Orith, lean and quick with the narrow shoulder markings of a combat trainee. He had come down to used the cargo bay for training himself, and had found me already there. He stood and watched me for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. The duel is in 7 days, he said. 6, I said without stopping my drill. He watched me work for a while, then he said, "You are not training the way soldiers usually train before a duel." With Commander Shricks. "No," I said. "What are you doing?" I paused for a moment to take a drink of water. "Tell me something," I said. "You've seen her fight. When does she make her first decisive move in a match?" Orith frowned. "Usually within the first 90 seconds. Has she ever not made that move in the first 90 seconds? He thought about it. "Match 7, he said after moment. The opponent retreated to the edge of the zone and kept distance. She waited him out. "Match 7, I said. "What happened at the 4-minute mark?" He looked at me carefully. "She changed her angle of approach." "She changed her angle," I said, "because her opponent had positioned himself in her right side visual edge, and she needed to adjust her depth perception. She gives up 2 degrees of peripheral accuracy when she makes that compensation, and she only does it when she's been patient for longer than 3 minutes. It's a minor habit. Most people would never notice it." Orith stared at me. "How do you know that?" "I watched the match 5 times, I said, "and then I watched match 19 and match 31, where the same thing happened. In a slightly different context. 3 data points." There was a long silence in the cargo bay. The engine hum continued underneath everything. Orith looked at me with an expression that had shifted somewhere between curiosity and something else. Something I recognized from having seen it once before when I was a child on a camping trip, and my uncle had come face to face with a perfectly still creature in the undergrowth that he had assumed was a harmless rock. The expression was a small involuntary recalibration. "You are looking for her patterns," he said. "I come from a very long line of creatures who survived by studying patterns," I said. "Where I come from, we were prey for a very long time. We learned to watch." Orith did not say anything to that. He trained in the far corner of the bay for a while in silence, and when he left quickly. I wrote in my notebook that evening he looked at me differently when he left than when he arrived. That is the correct direction. On the 5th day, something happened that I had not planned for. I was walking down the main corridor of level 3, heading toward the observation deck for another archive session, when I rounded a corner and found Jurix walking in the opposite direction with 2 of her officers. There was no time to take a side corridor. We came face to face with roughly 8 FT between us. She looked at me. I looked at her. Her 2 officers had the casual confidence of people who are near someone very powerful and have never once worried about it. Jurix herself moved through the ship the way certain people move through a room when they know nothing in it can surprise them. I nodded at her. She looked at me with steady, flat attention, the way a large and practiced predator looks at something it has already categorized and filed away. I held her gaze without looking away, and then I did something that I had not planned, but that felt exactly right in the moment. I let my eyes drop briefly to her left hip, not aggressively, not obviously, just a single quiet glance that lasted less than a second. Then I looked back up at her face and kept walking. Behind me I heard one of her officers say something in Verith dialect that the translator chip at my collar rendered as an Approximate phrase meaning, what was. That I did not hear Jurix respond. I kept walking and wrote nothing in the notebook about that moment because there was nothing to write. It had not been a strategy. It had just been honest. I had looked at the thing I had been thinking about and then I had kept moving, but when I got to the archive room and sat down, I noticed that my hands were very steady. That too felt right. On the 6th and 7th days, I did something that I suspect confused the non-human crew more than anything else I had done. I trained in deliberately bad conditions. I turned the temperature in cargo bay for up to 38 degrees and ran my drills in the heat until my shirt was soaked through. Then I turned it down to 12 degrees and kept going. I trained in near darkness, moving through my footwork patterns by feel more than sight. I skipped one full night of sleep and trained the following day on pure fatigue, watching myself the reflective cargo bay wall to check whether my technique was degrading and by how much it degraded. Somewhat. I noted by how much it degraded. Considerably less than I expected. Danny found me after the second heat session and stood in the doorway of the cargo bay with her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between exhausted and determined to understand. You're making yourself tired on purpose, she said. I am training in conditions I expect to be in during the match. I said, you expect to be overheated and sleep deprived in the match. I expect to be damaged. I said simply, I am training my body to continue functioning at a reduced level because I'm fairly confident that the match is going to reduce it. Danny was quiet for a moment, then she said, do you know what the Verith soldiers on level 5 have started calling you? No, I said. I don't have a clean translation, she said, but Orth gave me the rough version. It means something like the one that doesn't stop. I thought about that. That's fine, I said. That's the correct assessment. Danny looked at me for a long, quiet moment. Marcus, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly. I'll try. I said, are you doing this for the coalition, for the politics of it, for the human contingent, for any of that? I wiped my face with my towel and thought about it. Partly, I said, but mostly I'm doing it because I think it's important that someone shows what a human looks like when they don't just accept the conclusion that was written for them. Shriek stood up in that hall and told everyone what we are. I want to show her what else we are. Danny held my gaze for a long time, then she nodded once very slowly. All right, she said. Then you'd better win. I know, I said. On the 8th day I went back to the archive terminal for what I told myself would be the final time. I watched matches 7, 12, 19, 23, 31, and 38 in sequence, and then I closed the terminal and did not open it again. I had all the information I was going to have. What remained was the application of it, and that was a different kind of work entirely. On the 9th day I rested fully, completely rested. I slept 9 hours. I ate well. I walked slowly around the observation deck and watched the deep space moving outside the windows, the slow drift of distant star clusters in the dark. There was something very calming about that view. All that enormous distance, all that ancient light, and in the middle of it, one small ship carrying a few hundred creatures from a dozen worlds who were all in their own particular way trying to be something worth being. On the 10th day I oiled my boots, wrote 3 pages of final notes in my notebook, and went to bed early. On the morning of the 11th day, I got up at 5:08 a.m. Quiet breakfast alone in the empty mess hall, and then went to find the Duel registration desk to confirm my appearance. The officer at the desk, the same young Vereth with pale green collar markings who had handed me the form 11 days ago, looked up when I arrived. He looked at me differently than he had the first time. Then he confirmed my registration with a nod. I walked to the observation deck for one last look at the stars. When I walked into the arena bay 3 hours later, the crowd that met me was enormous. Every observation ring was full. I could see species I had rarely seen in the common areas, crew members who had apparently come specifically for this event. The noise was loud and layered, a dozen kinds of voices all contributing to a general hum of anticipation. Jurix was already on the floor when I entered. She stood at the center of the arena in full ceremonial Vereth armor, and she looked exactly like what she was, a machine built for this specific purpose. Undefeated, unbothered, and waiting, I walked to my mark on the opposite side of the arena in my standard human combat fatigues. No ceremony, no armor, just me and my notebook, which I tucked carefully into my jacket pocket because I intended to write in it between rounds, and the rules said nothing about notebooks. The noise from the crowd adjusted slightly when I walked in, not quieter exactly, but different, a shift in texture like the moment before. Something unexpected. The arena officer stepped to the center. I rolled my shoulders, breathed in once, long and slow, and looked across the space at Jurix. She was already looking at me. Not with contempt this time, with attention. I don't know if she had changed since the moment in the corridor when I glanced at her hip. I don't know if something in the 11 days between that moment and this one had shifted the way she saw this match, but the expression on her face was different from the one she had worn in the mess hall when she pointed at me and made a hall full of people laugh. This one was focused. Good, I thought. I wanted her focused. I wanted her taking this seriously. The worst thing that could have happened was for her to walk into this arena still laughing. The arena officer raised both hands and spoke the formal words of commencement. The match began, and Jurix did not wait a single second. She covered the distance between us in 5 long strides, and the first thing she hit me with was not her fist, it was her shoulder. The impact went through my chest like a wave and sent me sideways across the arena floor. I tucked my chin and rolled, came up on one knee, felt the sharp complaint from my left side where I had landed wrong, and stood up. The crowd made a sound, not laughter, something louder and more electric. Jurix had already reset. She stood 8 ft away, watching me stand up with eyes that had changed again. In the mess hall, the contempt had been comfortable and easy. Now it was something tighter, something actively applied. I settled my weight, kept my center low, and circled right. I was not going to win the next 4 minutes. I knew that going in. What I was going to do in the next 4 minutes was survive them, gather every piece of information my body and eyes could collect, and stay on my feet until the pattern I had studied from 44 recorded matches began to show itself in the actual flesh and movement of the person in front of me. Jurix pressed forward. I moved right. She adjusted. I moved right again. She was faster than I had imagined from the recordings, and the recordings were not Modest, her reach was enormous, and every time she made contact it cost me something I had to spend carefully. She hit me 3 more times in the first 2 minutes. The second hit caught my left shoulder at an angle I had not managed to clear in time, and I felt something pop that sent a white line of feedback straight through my neck. The crowd noise went up another level. I stayed on my feet. I circled right. She looked at me with those focused, flat eyes, and I could see her adjusting her assessment. In real time, she had expected me to be on the floor by now. The fact that I was not was a small piece of data that she was clearly and visibly adding to her picture of this match. Good. I took the information from my left shoulder and wrote it in my head next to everything else I was collecting, and I kept moving. By the time the first round ended, I had a damaged shoulder, a cut above my right eye, and a map inside my head of exactly how Jirix moved when she was comfortable, confident, and certain of the outcome. The round pause was 90 seconds. I stood at my mark, breathing through my nose, and I took out my notebook. I did not write a long entry. I wrote 4 words: left hip minute 4. Then I put the notebook away and looked across the arena at Jirix. For the first time since the moment in the corridor, she was not looking at her officers, not communicating with her support team, not performing anything for the crowd. She was looking at me, at the notebook. I put it back in my pocket. The arena officer raised his hands. The second round began, and I stopped circling right. I started circling left, pushing her to pivot right again and again, forcing her to turn on the slower side, the side with the old hip complaint, the side that 3 data points across 44 matches had told me would begin to compound its response time after consistent stress. She noticed the pattern after about 2 minutes. I saw it in the small adjustment she made to her stance. She knew I was directing her. She tried to counter it. I stayed with her, patient and quiet, and kept directing. At minute 4, I targeted the outer hip nerve cluster for the first time. Low force, specific location, the angle Dr. Wren had described. Not aggressive, just precise, like pressing a key rather than hitting a wall. Jirix pulled back half a step and looked at me. Not from pain. She was not in pain, but something in her body had registered something unexpected, and her brain had noticed the registration. I did it again 30 seconds later, and 30 seconds after that. The crowd had changed. I could hear it even without looking up. The loud electric noise had gone quieter and stranger, the way a room goes quiet when something is happening that people do not quite have language for yet. Jirix came at me with harder effort in the last 90 seconds of round 2, and she landed 3 hits that I absorbed badly. My ribs sent up a protest that was difficult to ignore. My left shoulder had gone from a sharp complaint to a dull roar. I was spending resources faster than I wanted to. But when the second round ended and I stood at my mark, I pulled out my notebook and wrote a different 4 words this time: she is working harder. Then I looked up. Jirix stood at her mark across the arena, and the expression on her face was something I had never seen in 44 recorded matches. It was uncertainty, not doubt, exactly not fear, just the first small, genuine appearance of a fighter who has not found the expected outcome and is no longer sure when it will arrive. I put my notebook away. The arena was very quiet around us, and from somewhere in the upper observation ring, I heard a Voice, I could not see who said it. Translation, Chip gave me the words in flat automatic English. Why does it keep? Standing up, I almost smiled. That I thought is exactly the right question. The 90-second break between the second and third rounds felt shorter than first. My body was communicating very clearly and with considerable urgency about the condition it was currently in. The shoulder was beyond sore. My ribs had moved past complaint and into something more structural. The cut above my eye had stopped bleeding, but the area around it had tightened in a way that limited how far I could open that eye. I stood at my mark and breathed through my nose in the slow, deliberate pattern I had practiced in the cargo bay when the temperature was 38 degrees and every breath was work. I took out my notebook. I looked at the 4 words I had written at the end of round 2. She is working harder. I added 3 more. The hip is slower. Then I wrote the thing I had been waiting to write since I signed my name on the registration form 11 days ago. I wrote it because I needed to see it on paper, needed to feel it settle from a plan into a fact. I wrote it small and neat in the bottom corner of the page. One technique, hold it, use it once. I put the notebook away. Xerix across the arena was talking to one of her officers. Her posture was still commanding, still every inch the combat prime of the 4th Fleet, but she was also standing with her weight shifted very slightly away from her left hip. Not dramatically, almost nothing, but I had spent 11 days learning to read her, and I could see it. She was compensating. The arena officer raised his hands for the 3rd round. Xerix came at me immediately, and she came harder than either of the previous rounds. Whatever uncertainty I had seen between rounds had been processed and converted into something she understood better. Force, she knew how to use force. She trusted it. It had won her 44 matches. She hit me in the ribs inside the first 20 seconds. The sound that came from the crowd told me what I already felt. That impact had found something fragile and made it more so. I went down to one knee on the arena floor, and the noise from the crowd went to its highest point yet. I heard individual voices in it. I heard the word done in 3 different languages from the translation chip. I looked at the floor for 1 second. The metal was cold and smooth under my hand. My ribs sent a signal that was honestly difficult to categorize. It was not quite like anything I had felt before. It was loud and it was persistent, and it made the air feel smaller. I stood up. Not quickly. I stood up the way you stand up when standing up is a deliberate choice rather than a reflexive one. I found my feet, found my center of gravity, found the low, steady breath, and I lifted my eyes to Xerix. She had stopped moving. She was standing 8 ft away, and she had stopped moving, and she was looking at me stand up with an expression that I will not pretend I had fully prepared for. I had prepared for her aggression. I had prepared for her power. I had not fully prepared for the way her face looked when she watched me rise from my knee, because it was not triumph, it was not contempt, it was not satisfaction. It was something closer to awe, or perhaps what is just underneath awe in the moment before you name it. She came at me again. I moved left, and in moving left, I forced her right pivot, and her left hip, now carrying 11 rounds of accumulated minor interference signal, gave her exactly the delay I had mapped. 3/10 of a second, maybe a little more. Now it was enough. I had studied this moment from every angle I could, Access, I had practiced the mechanics of it in the cargo bay until it was more reflex than decision. I had held it in reserve through 2 full rounds of punishment specifically because I needed it to land in this moment and not a second before I moved inside her reach. What I did next was not dramatic. There was no impact. There was no collision of force. It was a precise joint control technique, the kind that does not require strength to initiate but requires commitment to hold. I found the specific structural angle I needed, applied exactly the required level of leverage, and Jurek's commander in combat prime and 44 times undefeated found herself in a position she had not been in since the beginning of her career. She could not move forward. She could not move back without releasing the angle, and releasing the angle meant she would have to concede the zone, which under the duel's formal rules constituted a sustained incapacitation. She could break the hold, absolutely. She had the strength to do it, but breaking it the way available to her at that moment would damage her own shoulder joint. In avarice combat prime, whatever else she might do does not injure herself to escape a hold from a creature she publicly announced could not defeat her. We stood in that locked position for 40 seconds. I know because I counted. My ribs were explaining themselves to me in a language I could not ignore. My left shoulder was running out of the structural integrity I needed to maintain the hold. The sweat on my hands was making the grip genuinely difficult to keep. I breathed through my nose, slow and deliberate in the pattern I had trained in the cargo bay. In the dark at 38 degrees on no sleep, in every bad condition I had been able to find, and I held. The arena was silent. I have been in loud rooms my entire life. I grew up in a city of 6 million people. I have been on military vessels with hundreds of crew members and constant machinery noise and the general chaos of a populated ship. I have never been in a room as completely, absolutely silent as that arena was for the last 20 seconds of those 40. The timer sounded. I released the hold. My knees, freed from the necessity of holding everything together, expressed a strong opinion about the floor, and I went down on both of them. The arena floor was still cold. I put one hand on it and breathed. The judge's deliberation lasted 4 seconds. The arena officer announced the result: human victory by technical decision. The silence lasted another full second after the announcement. Then the room came apart. Not with the kind of noise that rooms make when a popular result happens, with the kind of noise rooms make when something has occurred that will require everyone present to reconsider a thing they thought they understood. Danny appeared at my side before the arena officer had finished speaking. She pulled my right arm over her shoulder and helped me up and said nothing at all, which was the right choice because there was nothing that needed saying. I looked across the arena. Jayark had not moved. She stood in the center of the arena floor, exactly where the hold had ended, and she was still, not performing stillness, not composing herself for the crowd, just standing there in a state of genuine and complete suspension, looking at the space where I had been. I met her eyes once before Danny walked me toward the medical bay exit. Jayark did not look away. I woke up in the medical bay to the clean smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of equipment, and to the particular kind of full-body awareness that arrives after your body has been through something serious and is now in The process of detailed complaint. 3. Rib fractures, a separated left shoulder, 2 hairline impacts on the forearm I had used to block in round 1. The cut above my eye had been sealed with medical adhesive. My nose had been broken at some point in round 2, and I genuinely had not noticed. Dr. Wren was standing at the foot of my cot reviewing my chart with her characteristic Orathi composure. She looked up when I opened my eyes. "Sergeant Vale," she said, "you have a remarkable capacity for continuing to function while damaged. I've been told," I said. "I mean this in a clinical sense," she said. "Your pain response threshold is not abnormal for your species. What is somewhat extraordinary is that your decision-making and technical precision did not measurably degrade in the final round despite a significant injury. Load, I practiced that part," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe you did." Danny was sitting in the chair beside my cot with her legs tucked under her and a cup of coffee in her hand. She handed it to me without a word when she saw me looking at it. I took a careful sip and felt the warmth of it move through my chest, which protested and then settled. "How long was I out?" I said. "About 5 hours, Danny said. "They gave you something for the pain and you went down like a light. What time is it?" "Late. Most of the ship is quiet." She wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at me over the rim. "You know, people have been standing outside this bay for 3 hours. "What people?" "All kinds," she said. "There are 4 Varith crew members in the corridor who have been there since I arrived. Orith is one of them. He asked me twice how you were doing." I thought about Orith, the young officer who had watched me in the cargo bay and left with a different expression than he arrived with. "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him you'd broken your nose and didn't notice," Danny said. "He did not seem to know how to respond to that." I almost laughed. "My ribs made the early stages of that a bad idea." "And Shrix," I said. Danny's expression shifted slightly. "Not worry, something more complex. She was in the arena for a long time after you left," she said. "I heard she didn't speak to anyone for over an hour." I absorbed that. "How did she look?" I said. Danny thought about it. "Like someone who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something else entirely," she said. "Not upset, not angry, just very, very quiet." I lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the medical bay. The hum of the ship was the same as always, constant and even, the deep machinery of a vessel moving through deep space. Outside the observation windows on the far side of the bay, the stars were as remote and steady as they ever were, indifferent to duels and rib fractures, and the small politics of coalition ships. I thought about the 40 seconds in the arena, not with pride exactly, with something quieter, with the feeling of a thing that was attempted being the thing that arrived. I closed my eyes for a while. When I opened them again, it was because the door to the medical bay had opened. Shrix stood in the doorway. She was not in her ceremonial armor. She was in the plain dark garments that Varith wear off duty, without rank markings, without the ceremonial shoulder plates. She looked without the armor, slightly less like a monument and slightly more like a person. She was still larger than anyone else in the room by considerable margin, but the scale of her was different. In plain clothes, more present somehow, more weight and less architecture. She stood in the doorway, for a moment and looked at the room. Her eyes found me in the cot. She held my gaze for a long moment, and then she came in and sat down in the chair across the room from my cot, the one farthest from me, as though she had calculated a respectful distance and chosen it deliberately. Danny looked at her, then at me. I gave a small nod. Danny picked up her coffee cup and walked very quietly to the far end of the medical bay, where she stationed herself by the window with her back to us, in the particular way people do when they are giving you privacy while remaining technically present. Shrix looked at me. She was doing something I had not seen in 44 recorded matches and 2 rounds of direct combat. She was sitting still, without projecting anything. No authority, no performance, no command presence. She was just sitting. How are your ribs? She said after a moment. 3 fractures, I said. Dr. Wren says they will heal cleanly. She nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at me. When I struck your ribs in the 3rd round, she said, I felt them break. I have 44 matches. I know what that impact means. In every previous match, when an opponent sustained that kind of structural damage, the fight ended. I know, I said. But you stood up, she said, not as a question, as a statement. She was turning over in her mind, testing for an explanation that fit. I did, I said. How? She said. I thought about it. I wanted to give her the real answer, not the efficient one, because she had come here alone without her officers, in plain clothes, and asked the question with her actual voice rather than with the armor around it. That deserved a real answer, because stopping felt worse than continuing. I said. She looked at me. Her eyes, which were the pale amber color of all Verith in the senior generation, held my face for a long time. I could see her turning the answer over, testing it, looking for the edge of it. That is not a tactical calculation, she said finally. No, I said. It is not. What is it? I shifted carefully against my pillow and thought about how to explain something that from the inside does not feel complicated, but that I understand looks very strange from the outside. My species, I said, has been afraid for a very long time. Not metaphorically, literally. We evolved on a planet with things that were bigger than us and faster than us, and had more natural tools than we did. We spent a long time being the thing that got hunted, and somewhere in all of that, a long time ago, we learned something that I don't think is built into every species. We learned that fear and stopping are 2 different things, that you can be afraid and still go, that the body can be in genuine distress and still function, that broken is not the same as finished. Shrix listened to every word of this without moving. We practiced it, I said, for 100,000 years. We practiced it, not consciously, not deliberately, but generation after generation. The ones who stood up when everything was telling them to stay down were the ones who survived and taught their children. So, when I stood up in round 3 with fractured ribs, I wasn't being heroic. I was being human. That's what we are. That is the oldest thing about us. Medical Bay was very quiet. Shrix did not speak for a long time. She sat across the room from me with her hands still and her eyes on my face, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone processing something genuinely new, not a new piece of information that fits into an existing framework, a new piece that requires the framework to expand. Then she her mouth and she closed it again. I had never seen that happen in 44 recorded matches. I had never seen anything stop the words in her throat. Xerix was a combat prime and a decorated officer and a public figure within the coalition fleet, a creature who had spent her entire career speaking with absolute command in front of large audiences. She opened her mouth to say something and the words did not come. She closed it. She looked at her hands, and for a single perfect moment, Commander Xerix, 44 duels in a lifetime of certainty, was simply and completely without words. I did not fill the silence. It did not need filling. It was doing its own work. When she finally looked up again, her expression had changed in a way I could not name. It was not defeat. It was not admiration. Exactly, it was something deeper and less categorized than either of those things. It was the look that arrives when a thing you thought you fully understood has revealed a room you did not know was there. I would like to know more, she said. Finally, about your species. There is a great deal to know, I said. I understand that now, she said, and there was nothing in her voice that was performing understanding. It was simply flatly true. I would like to begin. I looked at her for a moment, then I said, buy me a coffee, though fair warning. We have got a lot of history. We have been getting up from the floor for a very long time. She looked at me steadily. I understand that as well, she said. Now she stood to leave, and at the door she paused. She turned back and looked at me with that calm, deep attention she had given me in the arena between rounds. Only now there was nothing flat in it. Something had opened up behind the steadiness. You were afraid of me, she said, in round one. I could see it. Yes, I said, and it did not matter. No, I said, it did not. She held my gaze for one final moment, then she walked out. Danny drifted back from the window, settled into her chair, and looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked at me. Did she just get left speechless by a human explaining why humans stand up? She said, I think so. I said. Danny was quiet for a moment, then she shook her head slowly. I'm going to be telling this story for the rest of my life, Marcus. You'll need to fact-check the ribs part, I said. 3 fractures, not 4, she laughed. At that, actually laughed the real kind. I leaned back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and listened to the ship moving through the dark, steady and quiet, and carrying us all forward into whatever was next. 3 days later, Jerks came to the mess hall and bought me a coffee. She brought a notebook. It was a paper one. I did not say anything about that. I just smiled, and we sat down, and I started at the beginning.